Hey folks, Chris Van Viver here from WhyLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro 10. Today I want to talk about sidechaining because this is a technique that could be of so much value for creating space in your mixes. Before we dissect what sidechaining is and how to accomplish it, first let's examine a very common scenario, something that I think is very common for a lot of us, and that is the balance of the kick drum against our bass tracks. This oftentimes can be an area that is a bit of a struggle. And that's because the kick drum and the bass both live in the low end of the spectrum, and they're both fighting for power, for clarity, for punch, for space in our mixes. And this can be very difficult. Kick drums are very transient, as in they take up very short periods of time, where bass tracks oftentimes can sustain for long periods of time. So the bass oftentimes can obscure the space for the kick drum. So what we need is a way to have the bass kind of duck down each time the kick drum hits, so it's not stealing the power from the bass, but it's giving just a little bit of room for that kick drum to hang out. And sidechaining is a perfect opportunity to do exactly that. We can put a processor on the bass track, have it listen to the kick drum, and pay attention to the kick as a cue for when to process our bass. Now, sidechaining doesn't mean that processors are only listening to other instruments. We can use internal sidechaining as well, where the processor is just paying attention to a very specific aspect of the instrument that it's placed on. And I'll dig into internal sidechaining as well. So in our example of the bass and the kick drum, I have a riff here for us to take a listen to. Pay special attention to the kick and the bass and how they're hanging together in the mix. Okay, so we have a bass track that is very subby, that's very low end heavy, and we also have a kick that's pretty powerful, but still it could use a little more room in the bottom end of the spectrum. So let's solo our bass track and take a quick listen to these two tracks by themselves. Okay, there's also a very punchy nature to the bass track, where every time the note switches, there's kind of like this punch to it. So that'd be a really good opportunity as well to kind of duck those and leave the punch more to the kick drum and not the bass. Okay, so first things first, we're going to instantiate the compressor onto the bass track itself. And I'm going to set up the Studio VCA circuit, but you're welcome to use any one you'd like. And the next step here is that we need to indicate to the compressor to pay attention to not the bass track, but the kick drum track. So I'm going to go up here to the sidechain menu, click on it, and I know that the kick is being bussed to bus 16. So we'll select that. So now when I hit play, we should see the compressor react to the kick every time the kick hits. And let's compare that against nothing at all. So in this case, the compressor is reacting to the bass track and not the kick. So let's set this back up. Go back to bus 16 here. Okay, so now I'm going to fine tune some of the aspects of the compressor in relation to the kick, and we'll see how it goes. Cool, I'm feeling pretty good about that. So let's bypass and let's hear before and after, and I'll kind of turn it on as we're listening. It's crazy. It's like the kick drum suddenly comes into focus and it's like punchier now when the bass is getting ducked underneath it. So we're not losing the power of the bass, but we're giving the kick drum enough room to exist in our mix. And this can be really helpful as well for other instrument tracks, such as a main vocal that's competing for attention with a group of backing vocals or over-enthusiastic electric guitars. Now, like I mentioned before, we don't necessarily always have to use an external instrument, though many processors do rely on an external cue for when to process. In other cases, we can use what is known as an internal sidechain, where the processor is paying attention to a very specific aspect of the instrument that it's being used on. So in this case, let's just focus on our drums. And I'm going to bring in another instance of the compressor, and I'll set it to the platinum compressor here. Now, if we take a listen to just the drum track here, we're going to see that the compressor is going to be reacting to the kick drum because it's so much louder than all of the other aspects of the drums. And if I want to compress any of the other elements of these drums, it's going to be pretty hard because the kick drum will cause the compressor to overreact because it's the first thing to hit the compressor. Take a listen. So it's pretty tough. If I want to compress just the snare or the clap sound, we got to get around that kick drum somehow. And we can do exactly that. By clicking on this button here, Sidechain, we can actually use a filter and set the filter to a very specific frequency range of the instrument that we're working on. So in this case, we can set a frequency. We can set a mode from low pass to band pass, high pass, parametric to high shelf. We can also set the width, just like the channel EQ. And we can also adjust the gain based on these two different modes. So in this case, I'm going to use a high pass filter. I'm going to try to identify the attack of that snare clap combo so I can compress just that aspect of the kit and not the kick drum. So we're trying to leave out the kick drum in this case for compressing. And in this case, we're going to try to hone in on a very specific aspect of the frequency spectrum. So I'm going to set the filter to listen. So we're only going to hear the mode and the frequency that this filter is set to. Let's take a listen and I'll adjust some controls. And just like that, we were able to hone in on the snare itself, set the compressor to that snare attack, leaving out the kick drum, and now the compressor is reacting only to the snare. Now, of course, I do have a track stack here. I could have dug into the track stack and just turned down the snare, but, for demonstrative purposes of an internal sidechain. So again, sidechaining is a great opportunity to create space, clarity in our tracks. Oftentimes, a processor can look at a different track for a cue of when to react. In our case, we use the compressor on the bass to watch the kick drum, and every time the kick hit, it ducked the bass a tiny bit. But we can also use internal sidechains to focus on very specific aspects of the frequency range. And in our case, we were focusing in on the snare and trying to leave out the kick drum. So I hope that was helpful for you. As always, if it was, I highly suggest subscribing to the YouTube channel, Logic Pro Rules, or subscribing on the website itself, logicprorules.com. Every week, I'm posting new posts, new emails, new videos to help you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro 10. Thanks so much.